Good evening, dear traveler. Midnight Cat is here beside you, quiet-footed and watchful, while the lamps of the present grow dim. Settle beneath your blankets, let the room become still, and listen to the soft rain of another age against a distant roof. Tonight, we shall leave the familiar world behind and journey to the northern edge of Roman Britain, where stone forts stood beneath vast skies, and the empire ended not with a grand gate, but with wet grass, peat smoke, and a wall winding over lonely hills. Imagine, for a moment, that you are awake before dawn in a narrow barrack room. Around you, men breathe beneath rough woolen cloaks. Leather creaks. A coal glows faintly in a brazier. Beyond the shutters lies a land the Romans call Britannia, cold even in summer, and restless beyond the frontier. Somewhere in the darkness, a sentry stamps his feet upon the rampart. Somewhere farther north, beyond the wall, no Roman road promises safety. What was it truly like to live here, day after day, as one small soldier inside the enormous machinery of Rome? Not during a famous battle, nor beneath the gaze of an emperor, but on an ordinary morning when boots were damp, bread was hard, and the next letter from home might still be months away. The soldier sleeping nearest the door was named Marcus Flavius Celer, though there was little about him that seemed swift at that hour. He lay curled upon a straw mattress, one hand beneath his cheek, his dark hair flattened against the coarse blanket. He was 27 years old, and had served in the 6th Legion for almost 9 years. The Legion's full title, Legio Sexta Victrix Pia Fidelis, was grand enough to fill a monument, but in the barracks men usually called it simply the 6th. Marcus had been born near Ariminum on the eastern coast of Italy, where the air smelled of salt, figs, and warm dust. His father repaired fishing boats. His mother kept a small garden behind their house and sent dried herbs in packets whenever a merchant could be persuaded to carry them north. Marcus had joined the army young, not because of glory, but because 25 years of service promised regular pay, food, comradeship, and, at the end, a chance of security that a boat builder's son might otherwise never possess. Now he lived more than 1,000 miles from that sunlit shore. The trumpet sounded before sunrise. It was not a heroic sound. It was blunt, metallic, and impossible to ignore. Men stirred with groans, pulling tunics over cold skin. In the dim room, Marcus sat upright and reached for his socks. Roman soldiers were sometimes imagined marching everywhere in bare legs and sandals, but northern Britain had corrected such habits. Woolen socks, leggings, thick cloaks, and padded garments were prized here. Tablets found at frontier forts would one day preserve requests for socks and warm clothing, small messages more revealing than the speeches of emperors. Marcus wrapped his feet carefully. A blister could make a march miserable, and a neglected wound could become dangerous. He then drew on his caligae, the heavy military sandals whose leather soles were studded with iron hobnails. Several nails were loose. He made a note to visit the fort's workshop before inspection. Around him, the 8 men of his contubernium prepared for the day. They shared this room, their equipment stacked along the walls and their shields stored where damp would do the least harm. They also shared a larger life. Meals, marching duties, punishment, jokes, debts, and the endless small irritations of men who had slept within arm's reach of one another for years. Their senior man, Titus, opened the shutter. Gray light entered. The fort stood close to Hadrian's wall, the great frontier barrier ordered by the emperor some years earlier. From the rampart, The wall ran east and west over the ridges, sometimes vanishing into mist, sometimes shining pale beneath the sun. It was not a single unbroken line of soldiers facing north. It was a system of stone, turf, ditches, gates, roads, mile castles, watchtowers, and forts. Patrols moved along it. Merchants passed through controlled crossings. Local farmers brought cattle, hides, grain, and news. The frontier divided territories, but it also connected them. Marcus stepped outside. The cold met him at once, carrying the sense of wet earth, wood smoke, horses, and yesterday's cooking fires. The barrack blocks stood in orderly rows, their red-tiled roofs dark with rain. Beyond them rose the headquarters building, the granaries with their raised floors, the commander's residence, the workshops, the hospital, and the stone gates. Even at the empire's edge, Rome arranged space according to familiar patterns. A soldier transferred from the Rhine or the Danube might enter such a fort and understand its shape almost immediately. Men hurried across the central street. A mule protested somewhere near the storehouses. From the ovens came the smell of bread, dense and slightly sour. Near the granary, 2 soldiers rolled a barrel beneath an awning while a clerk watched with wax tablet in hand. Marcus joined his century for morning inspection. His centurion, Gaius Aelius Crispus, walked slowly along the line. Crispus was not an old man, though frontier service had carved deep marks beside his mouth. A centurion was expected to maintain order, and order began with details. Belts must be fastened. Weapons must be clean. Cloaks must be folded correctly. A soldier who neglected a strap might neglect a gate. A man careless with a buckle might be careless on night watch. Crispus stopped before Marcus. His gaze fell to the sandals. "Workshop," he said. Marcus nodded. "After drill." The centurion moved on. No speech followed. None was needed. The rain began again, soft at first, whispering across helmets and shoulders. Beyond the fort, the open country faded into low cloud. Marcus looked north for only a moment. He had been told many stories about the land beyond the wall. Some were soldiers' inventions, enlarged during long evenings over watered wine. Others came from traders who knew the paths between settlements and could name families on both sides of the frontier. Rome called the people there barbarians, but Marcus had learned that such words were broad and convenient. The northern peoples farmed, raised animals, traded goods, honored their own leaders, and understood the landscape far better than any newly arrived Roman officer. The trumpet sounded again. The century turned toward the training ground, shields lifting in a single practiced motion. Their day had begun, not with battle, but with repetition. The patient discipline upon which the empire quietly depended. On the training ground outside the barracks, the rain settled into a fine silver veil. It darkened the packed earth, gathered along the rims of shields, and ran in narrow streams from the brims of helmets. Marcus stood among the men of his century with a wooden practice sword in his right hand and a wicker shield strapped to his left arm. The wooden sword was heavier than the iron weapon he carried on duty. The practice shield, too, had been made deliberately burdensome. The army trained its soldiers with greater weight than they would bear in battle, so that real equipment might later feel almost merciful. Before them stood a row of stout wooden posts driven into the ground. Marcus had struck such posts thousands of times. He advanced with his left foot, shield forward, and thrust at the center of the post. The movement was compact and direct. Roman drill favored the thrust over the wide, sweeping cut. A thrust required less room in a close formation, exposed less of the body, and could be repeated with grim efficiency. Yet here, beneath the wet morning sky, there was nothing grim in the sound. Only the steady knock of wood against wood, the scrape of sandals, and the centurion's occasional correction. Again. Marcus stepped back and repeated the motion. Again. The army trusted repetition because repetition survived fear, confusion, darkness, and noise. A soldier did not need to invent courage at the moment of danger. He needed only to remember what his body had been taught. Beside him, a young recruit named Publius struck too high. He had arrived from southern Gaul only 3 months earlier, and still carried the look of a man surprised by northern weather. Crispus moved behind him, placed 2 fingers against the recruit's elbow, and pushed it lower. Keep the shield close. Publius adjusted his stance. Marcus noticed the boy's hands were red from cold. He remembered his own first winter in Britain, when rain had seemed to fall sideways, and no fire had ever felt large enough. Older soldiers had laughed at his complaints, though later they had quietly shown him how to line his sandals with wool and keep spare cloth beneath his tunic. After sword drill came throwing practice. Each man took up a pilum, the heavy Roman javelin with its long iron shank. The soldiers aimed at bundles of woven brush. Some missiles struck firmly, others landed crooked in the wet ground. The drill was not ceremonial. Weapons had to become familiar in every condition, even when fingers were numb and mud clung to the soles. By mid-morning, the rain had eased. Low clouds broke apart above the hills, revealing pale strips of blue. The men marched in formation along the road west of the fort, carrying shields, helmets, weapons, tools, and packs. A legionary on campaign might bear a considerable load. Even on training marches, the weight was enough to bend the shoulders of new recruits and make the hips ache before noon. The road beneath them was firm and carefully laid. Ditches carried water away from the surface. Stones fitted tightly underfoot. Rome's roads were not always straight in the manner of later legend, but they were built with purpose, linking forts, ports, towns, quarries, and supply depots across immense distances. Marcus had marched on roads through Italy, Gaul, and Britain. He knew their moods. In summer, they held heat until evening. In winter, they glittered with frost. In heavy rain, they shone beneath the sky like long strips of dark metal. To the south lay scattered farms and enclosed fields. Thin smoke rose from roundhouses and timber buildings. Sheep grazed along the slopes, their wool darkened by rain. Some families here had lived in the region long before the army arrived. Others had settled near the forts because soldiers created demand for grain, meat, leather, pottery, ale, cloth, and labor. The frontier was not empty. Outside, nearly every large fort grew a settlement that the army did not fully command. Traders kept shops there. Craftsmen repaired buckles and harnesses. Innkeepers served meals and drink. Veterans sometimes remained after discharge, marrying, buying land, or opening small businesses. Wives, children, servants, migrants, and local families filled the streets. Though ordinary legionaries were officially restricted from legal marriage during much of the imperial period, many formed lasting households all the same. The law could deny a name to such bonds, but it could not prevent affection, responsibility, or worry. Marcus knew this well. In the settlement beyond the eastern gate lived a woman called Livia, daughter of a leather worker from Eboracum. She was not his wife in the eyes of the army, yet she had shared his life for 5 years. Their small house stood behind her father's workshop, with a roof that leaked near the hearth and a narrow garden where onions, cabbage, and a few stubborn herbs survived the cold. Their daughter, Flavia, was nearly 4. When Marcus thought of the future, he did not imagine triumphal arches. He imagined a legal discharge, a grant of money, and a house where no trumpet could order him from bed before dawn. The marching column turned north toward the wall. As they climbed, the landscape widened around them. The stone barrier followed the high ground in long, measured lines. On its northern side lay a broad ditch, cut to hinder approach. To the south, in places, ran another great earthwork of banks and a central ditch, now called the vallum. Roads, gates, and forts tied the system together. From a distance, the wall seemed permanent, almost natural, as though the ridges had grown a spine of pale stone. Up close, Marcus knew better. Mortar cracked, drains clogged, frost shifted masonry, grass took root between stones, wind loosened tiles. Everything required repair. That afternoon, his century was assigned to precisely such work. Near a mile castle, winter rain had damaged the edge of the road. Soldiers lifted stones, cleared mud, and packed fresh gravel into the weakened section. Marcus set down his shield and worked with a mattock. His hands warmed through effort. Sweat gathered beneath his tunic despite the cold. This, too, was a soldier's life. The legions built bridges, forts, roads, drains, bathhouses, workshops, and storehouses. They cut timber, quarried stone, baked tiles, dug ditches, and repaired what weather or neglect had damaged. A man might spend far more time carrying a basket of rubble than carrying a sword. Publius worked beside Marcus, breathing heavily. "Did you join for this?" he asked. Marcus rested on the handle of his tool. "I joined for bread." Publius smiled. A cart approached from the west, drawn by 2 small horses. The driver wore a thick checked cloak fastened at the shoulder. Behind him were baskets covered with hide. At the nearby gate, auxiliary soldiers inspected the load before allowing the cart southward. Marcus watched without appearing to. The driver spoke briefly with the guards. One basket was opened. Inside lay wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. A wooden tablet changed hands. Then the cart continued toward the fort. Trade passed through the frontier in both directions. So did messages, rumors, gifts, agreements, and people whose loyalties could not be marked neatly on any military map. By late afternoon, the repaired road lay level again. The men gathered their equipment, tired but quieter than they had been in the morning. The sky had cleared toward the west, where the descending sun touched the wet hills with a faint bronze light. As the sentry returned to the fort, Marcus heard ravens calling from the ridge. Their dark shapes crossed above the wall and vanished northward, where no boundary hindered them. The ravens were gone by the time Marcus passed beneath the fort's western gate. Evening had settled into the courtyards, carrying with it the warmer smells of cooking grain, smoke, damp wool, and animal fat. The day's labor had left mud dried in pale streaks along his calves, and his shoulders felt the familiar deep heaviness that came after carrying tools and equipment for hours. Inside the barrack room, the men set down their packs with care. A shield thrown carelessly against a wall could split at the rim. A wet cloak bundled into a corner would smell sour by morning. Every object had its place, not because the soldiers were naturally tidy, but because crowded life punished disorder. Titus knelt beside the brazier and coaxed a flame from the coals. Publius removed his sandals and discovered a blister on his heel. Another man, Lucius, laughed softly and passed him a strip of clean cloth. Marcus examined the loose nails in his own soles. The workshop would still be open for a little while, so he took the sandals beneath one arm and crossed the fort in his stockinged feet. The fabrica stood near the central buildings, where the sound of hammers often continued long after drill had ended. Within, craftsmen repaired weapons, armor, wagons, hinges, locks, tools, harnesses, and countless other necessities. The army required not only fighting men but skilled hands: smiths, carpenters, leather workers, masons, clerks, surveyors, and men who understood the temper of iron or the grain of oak. Heat rolled from the forge as Marcus entered. Sparks rose briefly into the smoky air. A broad-shouldered soldier named Sextus sat at a bench, replacing rivets in a helmet cheekpiece. He glanced at Marcus's sandals and held out his hand. "You waited too long?" "They were sound yesterday." They were not. Sextus turned one sandal over and pressed a thumb against the sole. Two hobnails shifted. Marcus leaned against the bench while the craftsman worked. The shop smelled of charcoal, hot metal, leather, and oil. Along the walls hung tongs, hammers, punches, files, and wooden patterns. Broken buckles lay in a tray awaiting repair. A bent spearhead rested beside a coil of wire. Nothing useful was discarded until it had become truly useless. Outside, a clerk called the names of men assigned to the night watches. Marcus listened without concern at first. Then he heard his own. "Second watch, North Gate." He closed his eyes briefly. The second watch came at an unpleasant hour, late enough to break sleep and early enough to leave little of the night afterward. Still, every soldier knew that guard duty lay at the heart of frontier life. Gates, storehouses, ramparts, prisoners, standards, and headquarters all required sentries. A man who slept at his post faced severe punishment, for a sleeping guard might endanger the entire fort. Sextus drove the final nail into place and handed back the sandals. Better than new. They were new once. Everything was. Marcus left before the philosopher of the workshop could charge him for wisdom. At the barracks, supper was ready. The men of the contubernium shared a meal of barley porridge thickened with beans, onions, and small pieces of smoked pork. There was bread from the fort ovens, and a little cheese purchased from a trader. The food was simple, but hunger gave it depth. Steam rose from the bowls. Rain tapped lightly on the roof. Roman military rations commonly included grain, usually wheat, together with other supplies when available. Yet what soldiers actually ate varied with place, season, transport, and personal means. Archaeological remains from frontier sites reveal a surprisingly broad diet: cattle, sheep, pigs, fish, poultry, fruit, nuts, herbs, and imported goods, though not every soldier enjoyed every food equally. Marcus softened a piece of bread in the porridge. Across from him, Lucius produced a small jar of fish sauce sent from the south. He added a few drops to his bowl while the others watched with interest. Publius sniffed it and frowned. "You will learn," Lucius said. "Learn what?" "That nearly everything tastes better when it smells worse." The men laughed, quietly enough that the sound remained within the room. After the meal, Marcus washed his bowl and prepared for a few hours of rest. He removed his belt and laid his sword within reach. The brazier glowed low. One by one, the voices faded. Sleep came quickly. When Titus shook his shoulder, the room was dark. Marcus rose without speaking. He pulled on his tunic, mail shirt, cloak, belt, and helmet. The metal links were cold against the padded garment beneath. He checked his sword, took up his spear and shield, and stepped outside with the other men assigned to the watch. The fort had changed. By day, it was filled with movement and commands. At night, its streets belonged to torchlight, shadow, and distant footsteps. Lamps burned in the headquarters building. From the stables came the shifting of horses. A dog lifted its head as Marcus passed, then curled again beneath an overhang. At the north gate, the previous sentries waited to be relieved. Passwords were exchanged. Orders were repeated. The gate itself was closed, its heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron fittings. Above, the guard chamber opened onto the wall walk. Marcus climbed the stone steps. The wind struck him at the top, carrying the clean, cold smell of the hills. Clouds moved across the moon, and the land beyond the wall appeared and disappeared in broad, dark shapes. The ditch below was a deeper band of black. Farther north, scattered points of fire marked farms or small settlements. Marcus took his position. For a long while, nothing happened. That was the true difficulty of sentry duty. Danger rarely announced itself. Most nights brought only cold, boredom, and the temptation to let attention drift. A guard had to listen to each uncertain sound and decide whether it was wind, animal, traveler, or something requiring alarm. He heard an owl call from the west. Grass whispered along the ditch. Somewhere below, a man cleared his throat. Marcus flexed his fingers around the shaft of the spear. He thought of Livia and Flavia asleep beyond the eastern gate. Their house would be dark now, the hearth banked beneath ash. Flavia often kicked away her blanket during the night. Livia would wake and pull it over her again. He pictured the room so clearly that for a moment the frontier vanished. Then a light moved in the distance. Marcus straightened. It was faint and low, perhaps a lantern carried along a northern path. It disappeared behind a fold in the ground, returned, and vanished once more. The other sentry had seen it too. Neither man spoke. They watched until the light emerged nearer the wall, accompanied at last by the soft clatter of hooves. A small group was approaching the gate at an hour when gates were not ordinarily opened. Marcus called down into the darkness, asking who came and for what purpose. A voice answered in accented Latin. Message for the prefect. The riders halted beyond the ditch, where the moon touched the backs of their horses. One figure held up a narrow wooden tablet sealed with cord. Marcus did not order the gate opened. Instead, he sent word to the officer of the watch and remained above, looking down at the still riders while the cold wind moved between them and the silent country stretched north into darkness. The officer of the watch arrived with 2 men carrying lamps sheltered behind horn panels. Their light moved across the gate tower, touching stone, iron, and the tired faces of the sentries. Below, the riders remained where Marcus had ordered them to wait. The officer leaned over the parapet. "Name your business," the same voice answered. It belonged to a man wrapped in a dark woolen cloak, his hood thrown back despite the cold. "Calidus, son of Brannock. I bring warning from the northern valley." Marcus knew the name. Calidus had crossed the frontier before, sometimes with cattle, sometimes with hides, and once with a cartload of rough pottery that had sold better than anyone expected. He belonged to one of the communities north of the wall whose leaders maintained an uncertain peace with Rome. Such men were called allies when relations were good and suspects when they were not. The sealed tablet was placed in a leather pouch, tied to a cord and drawn up from below. The officer inspected the seal but did not break it. "The prefect will read this," he said. "You will wait until morning." Calidas accepted the decision without argument. The riders moved away from the ditch and settled beside the road, where they dismounted and wrapped themselves in their cloaks. One of them gathered heather and dry grass from beneath an overhanging rock, but no fire was lit. A fire near the gate at night might have illuminated more than Roman officers wished to reveal. The officer departed with the message. Marcus returned to his place. The night became quiet again, though not as quiet as before. Now every sound seemed connected to the riders below. A horse shook its harness. Someone coughed. The wind pressed against the gate doors and found narrow gaps between the planks. Marcus wondered what the tablet contained. Perhaps a dispute between neighboring groups. Perhaps news of stolen animals. Perhaps a request for grain, protection, or permission to pass through the frontier. Warnings traveled often in such places, and not all proved true. A rumor might begin beside a hearth, cross 3 valleys, and arrive at a Roman fort transformed into an army. Yet the prefect would not ignore it. The empire's northern boundary depended upon more than walls and sentries. It depended upon information. Traders noticed unusual gatherings. Shepherds saw tracks on remote paths. Local leaders sent word when rivals moved cattle or armed men. Scouts listened in settlements where Latin mixed with native languages. A frontier could not be watched from stone towers alone. When the watch ended, the eastern sky had begun to pale. Marcus descended with stiffness in his knees. The riders were still waiting beyond the gate, silent shapes beside their horses. He surrendered the password to the relief guard and crossed the fort toward the barracks. Sleep lasted only a little while. The morning trumpet came through his dreams like a blade through cloth. He woke with his cloak still folded beneath his head and the taste of fatigue in his mouth. Outside, the fort was already stirring around the message. Nothing had been announced, yet soldiers noticed movement. Mounted messengers prepared horses near the headquarters. Clerks hurried between buildings with tablets held under their cloaks. The prefect's orderly entered the granary, then emerged beside the quartermaster. At the main gate, auxiliary cavalrymen checked girths and reins. Rumor filled the spaces where orders had not yet arrived. Lucius claimed that 3 northern communities had joined against Rome. Titus said the matter concerned raiders and stolen cattle. Publius had heard that a patrol was missing, though he could not say where he had heard it. Marcus ate bread and cheese without contributing. Years in the army had taught him that rumors grew strongest before breakfast and weakest after official inspection. The truth, when it came, was less dramatic and more useful. Several farms north of the wall had been abandoned over the previous 2 days. Their inhabitants had driven animals westward, away from a route commonly used by traders. Calidas believed that a large group of armed men was moving through the district, though he did not know their purpose. They might be gathering for a feud. They might intend to raid livestock near the frontier. They might disperse before Roman scouts found them. Until more was known, patrols would be increased. Marcus's century was ordered to prepare for 2 days beyond the wall. There was no cheer and no complaint loud enough for the centurion to hear. Men returned to the barracks and began packing. Each soldier carried food, cloak, tools, weapons, cooking vessels, and small personal items. Grain was measured into bags. Bacon and hard cheese were divided. Water skins were inspected for leaks. Marcus wrapped a whetstone needle, thread, and a tiny wooden figure of Fortuna in a scrap of cloth. The figure had belonged to his mother. He did not believe the goddess guaranteed safety, but he had carried it too long to leave it behind. Before departure, he received permission to visit the settlement. The eastern gate stood open beneath a lifting mist. Outside, the civilian streets were muddy and busy. Shop shutters were being raised. Smoke curled from ovens. A woman swept rainwater from a doorway, while two children chased a limping chicken between the houses. Livia was cutting leather in her father's workshop when Marcus entered. She looked up once and understood from his equipment that he was leaving. How long? 2 days, perhaps 3. She set down the knife. Flavia sat near the hearth arranging colored stones in a row. When she saw Marcus, she ran to him and wrapped both arms around one of his legs. He lifted her, feeling the warmth of sleep still in her hair. "Bring me something," she said. "What shall I bring?" She considered this seriously. "A feather. There are feathers here. Not a northern one." Marcus promised to look. Livia brought him a small cloth parcel containing oat cakes, an onion, and a sprig of dried mint. Such offerings were common between them, practical things given in place of speeches. She straightened the fold of his cloak and checked the fastening at his shoulder. "Do not trust the ground after rain," she said. Her father had traveled north often enough to know the marshes. Marcus nodded. There were many words they did not use. The army had trained them both in departures. He placed Flavia beside the hearth, touched Livia's hand, and returned to the fort. By midday, the patrol assembled outside the north gate. 24 legionaries stood beneath a sky the color of pewter, accompanied by 6 auxiliary cavalrymen and 2 local guides. Calatus was among them, mounted on a small, sturdy horse. His expression revealed nothing. The gate opened. Beyond it lay the ditch, the road, and the long rising country. Marcus crossed through the wall with his shield on his back and the taste of mint on his tongue. Behind him, Rome remained marked in stone, tiled roofs, measured streets, and the thin smoke of cooking fires. Ahead, the path narrowed between wet hills where no milestones stood. By late afternoon, even the wall had disappeared behind the folds of the land. The land beyond the wall unfolded in long slopes of heather, coarse grass, and black patches of bog, where water reflected the dim sky. The patrol moved in a narrow column, following a path that existed more clearly in the memory of the guides than upon the ground. Marcus walked near the center, his shield secured across his back and his spear balanced over one shoulder. Each step sank slightly into the wet earth. The hobnails in his repaired sandals gripped stone well enough, but on clay they slid without warning. Livia's advice remained with him. Do not trust the ground after rain. Calatus rode ahead beside the auxiliary decurion. He seldom turned. His horse picked its way with the certainty of an animal raised among these hills, avoiding soft ground that looked no different from the firm turf around it. The Roman road had ended miles behind them. Here, there were only tracks between farms, grazing places, streams, and wooded valleys. Yet the country was not wild in the sense that some southern writers imagined. Low ridges bore the marks of old fields. Stone boundaries crossed hillsides. Smoke rose from distant roofs. People had shaped this landscape for generations, though they had done so without straight roads, milestones, or the red tiles that made Roman settlements visible from afar. The patrol passed an abandoned farm before sunset. It stood upon a low rise, sheltered from the western wind. A roundhouse of timber and woven walls occupied the center of an enclosure, its conical roof dark with damp. A smaller structure leaned nearby, perhaps a storehouse or animal shelter. The gate had been left open. Crispus raised his hand. The column halted. Two auxiliaries rode around the enclosure while the legionaries entered on foot. Marcus lowered his spear and followed Titus through the gate. No one waited inside. The central hearth held gray ash, cold but not ancient. A wooden bowl lay overturned near the wall. Rushes had been scattered across the floor, and a broken spindle rested beside a low sleeping platform. The people who lived here had not departed in calm order. They had taken what they could carry and abandoned the rest. Marcus crouched beside the hearth. Pressed into the earth nearby were the small marks of a child's feet. He thought of Flavia arranging stones beside the fire. Outside, Crispus examined the animal enclosure. The ground was churned where cattle or sheep had been driven out quickly. Calatus dismounted and studied the tracks without touching them. "West," he said. "Your people?" asked the decurion. "Some of them." The answer was neither defensive nor helpful. Calatus pointed toward a higher ridge. They went there first. After that, perhaps into the valley. Why? They were afraid. Of whom? Calatus looked north, where evening mist had begun to collect between the hills. If I knew, I would have written it. The patrol remained at the farm for the night. The choice offered shelter and a clear view of the surrounding country, though no one wished to sleep inside the empty house. Men who had mocked northern superstitions at the fort now preferred the open ground to a dwelling abandoned in haste. They made a small camp within the enclosure. No marching fort was built. The patrol lacked the time and numbers for the ditches and ramparts of a full legionary camp. Instead, sentries were placed along the rise, packs arranged in order, and cooking fires kept low. Marcus and the men of his contubernium ground grain with a small hand mill carried between them. The work was slow. One man fed kernels into the central opening, while another turned the upper stone. Flour gathered on a cloth beneath, pale against the fading light. They mixed it with water and salt, then baked flat cakes upon a heated stone. Bacon hissed in a bronze pan. The dried mint Livia had given Marcus released its scent when crushed between his fingers, briefly transforming the damp northern evening into something nearer to home. The men ate in silence. Night settled gradually. The last color faded from the west, leaving only the red cores of the fires and a thin moon behind clouds. Somewhere in the valley, sheep called once and then became quiet. Marcus had first watch. He stood at the edge of the enclosure, looking down upon the path by which they had come. The darkness beyond was not empty. It contained water moving in unseen streams, wind bending the heather, and animals whose steps could resemble human feet when heard at a distance. The nearby roundhouse made soft sounds as its timbers cooled. Marcus tried not to imagine the family who had lived there. He pictured them walking westward with blankets, children, baskets, and frightened animals. Perhaps they were safe among relatives. Perhaps their flight had been unnecessary. A shape moved below the rise. Marcus lifted his spear. It emerged from the darkness slowly, pale and low to the ground. For several breaths he could not name it. Then the shape raised its head, and moonlight caught the long face of a pony. The animal wore a rope halter, but no rider. Marcus whistled softly to the nearest sentry. Together they descended a little way, speaking gently so as not to startle it. The pony trembled. its coat wet and its flanks marked with mud. A broken length of rope trailed from the halter. Kalidas was awakened and came down from the camp. He approached the animal without haste, holding out one hand. The pony allowed him near. He touched its neck, then examined a dark stain along the saddlecloth. Marcus watched his face. "Blood?" he asked. Kalidas rubbed the stain between his fingers and smelled it. "Not much. Do you know the animal?" Kalidas nodded. "It belongs to a trader named Iogen. He uses the western track." The decurion joined them. Where would he have been traveling? "South," said Kalidas, "toward the gate." The men looked into the darkness from which the pony had come. At dawn, the patrol followed its tracks. The trail led northwest, descending from the open hillside into a narrow valley where birch and alder grew beside a fast stream. Mist hung among the trees. Droplets gathered on every branch and fell with the soft, irregular rhythm of rain, though the sky above was clear. The soldiers moved more slowly here. Shields were carried on the arm. The cavalrymen dismounted and led their horses over root and stones. Near the stream they found the remains of a small fire, carefully scattered but not fully concealed. There were hoof prints, boot marks, and the impression of several bodies where people had rested upon the ground. Crispus knelt beside the ashes. "Last night," he said. Kalidas studied the tracks beyond the fire. Some continued north, others crossed the stream. Marcus found a wooden comb beneath a fern, its teeth carved from bone. One side was decorated with a simple pattern of circles. He turned it over in his hand. A traveler might easily have dropped it, or someone might have left in haste. From farther up the valley came a single, sharp cry. The patrol froze. It was not a bird. It sounded human, brief and distant, followed by the clatter of loose stones. Crispus rose and signaled the men forward. They advanced between the trees, no longer speaking. The stream curved out of sight. Beyond it, the valley narrowed beneath dark cliffs, and somewhere ahead, hidden by mist and leaves, a horse began to whinny. The horse's call echoed between the cliffs, rose above the stream, and faded into the dripping leaves. Crispus closed his hand. The patrol stopped at once. Marcus stood with one foot upon a root and the other in shallow water, feeling the cold current press around his sandal. Ahead, the mist shifted between alder trunks. Nothing moved openly, yet the valley no longer seemed empty. The soldiers listened for another cry, another hoofbeat, any sound that might reveal the shape of what waited beyond the bend. The decurion sent 2 cavalrymen up the eastern slope. They tethered their horses below and climbed on foot, moving carefully through fern and wet stone. Kalidas watched them disappear without comment. Crispus divided the legionaries. Half would remain near the stream, guarding the path and the animals. The others would follow him along the western bank. Marcus went with Crispus. They advanced slowly, shields raised, spears angled forward. The stream narrowed as the cliffs drew closer. Water hurried over smooth rocks, white in the gray morning. Branches caught at helmets and cloaks. Beneath the trees lay the smell of wet bark, bruised fern, and old leaves. After perhaps 200 paces, Marcus saw the horse. It stood wedged among hazel bushes above the stream, reins tangled around a branch. Its saddle had slipped beneath its belly. Foam marked the corners of its mouth, and one foreleg trembled each time it tried to pull free. No rider was visible. Crispus signaled the men to spread out. Marcus climbed towards the animal with Titus beside him. The horse rolled its eyes but was too exhausted to fight when Titus caught the bridle. Marcus cut the twisted leather strap and eased the saddle away. A pack lay farther upslope, split open upon the stones. Small objects had spilled from it: dyed thread, bronze pins, a clay cup, several folded pieces of cloth, and a leather purse whose contents had vanished. Caledus reached them and crouched beside the scattered goods. "Iogans," he said. He picked up a bronze pin shaped like a bird and turned it in his fingers. His expression changed only slightly, but Marcus saw recognition settle into it. Below, one of the soldiers called. They found the traitor in a hollow beneath the cliff. He was alive. Iogan lay wrapped in a checked cloak, one hand pressed against his side. His hair was streaked with gray and rainwater. A shallow cut marked his forehead, but the darker stain beneath his cloak came from a wound near the ribs. When Caledus spoke his name, the traitor opened his eyes. For several moments he seemed unable to understand what he saw. Then his gaze moved from Caledus to the Roman shields behind him. "They took them," he whispered. "Who?" Caledus asked. Iogan swallowed. "The men from the eastern ridge, or men dressed like them. I could not see. They came in the rain." Crispus knelt beside him. "How many?" 10, perhaps more." "Where did they go?" "North first, then west." "And the people from the farms?" Iogan's breathing became uneven. "With them, some walking, some bound." The valley seemed to grow colder. Crispus asked whether the captives had resisted, whether anyone had been killed, whether the raiders carried Roman weapons or wore recognizable markings. Iogan could answer only in fragments. He had been traveling south when he encountered the group. They had struck him from his horse, taken his purse, and driven the animals ahead. He had crawled to the hollow after nightfall. The wound was not deep enough to expose the bone, but it had bled heavily. A soldier trained as a capsarius cleaned it with water, pressed linen against it, and wrapped the traitor's chest tightly. The army's medical orderlies were not physicians in the learned sense, yet experience had taught them how to bind wounds, set simple fractures, and recognize when a man might still be moved. Iogan was given watered wine. Color returned slowly to his face. The scouts came down from the ridge with news of a larger trail heading west. Many people had passed there: men, women, children, livestock, and several horses. The ground was churned deeply enough that even Marcus could read the signs. The decurion wanted to continue at once. Crispus looked at the sky. Clouds had thickened over the valley. The light carried the dull green color that often preceded another long rain. A pursuit through unknown country, with an injured man and tired soldiers, could become more dangerous than the group they followed. Caledus studied the tracks. "They are not moving quickly," he said. "Too many cattle, too many children." "Where are they going?" asked Crispus. "There is an old enclosure west of here, above the river. Stone walls, one narrow approach." "A settlement?" "Once. Now shepherds use it in summer." The Roman officers exchanged a glance. Such a place could serve as refuge, meeting ground, or trap. Iogan could not walk. 2 men fashioned a litter from spears, cloaks, and branches, while the others gathered his scattered goods. The rescued horse was led beside him. Marcus placed the bone comb he had found among the trader's belongings, though Iogan said it was not his. They followed the western trail. The valley opened gradually, its trees thinning into moorland. Rain began near noon, not violently, but with steady patience. Water gathered on Marcus's eyebrows and ran beneath the edge of his helmet. His cloak grew heavy. The litter sank into soft ground, forcing the bearers to change often. The tracks remained clear. Here a child had slipped, leaving the print of one hand in the mud. There, a cartwheel had cut deeply before being dragged free. Once they found a dead sheep beside the path, abandoned rather than carried. These signs troubled Marcus more than the rumor of armed men. They belonged to a movement too large and weary to be a simple raiding party. Whatever had happened, whole households were being driven across the country. By late afternoon, the patrol reached a ridge overlooking a broad river. On the opposite bank, mist drifted across low fields. To the west rose a steep hill crowned by broken stone walls. Coletus pointed. The enclosure. Smoke climbed from within it. Not one fire, but many. Crispus ordered the men below the crest, where they could not be seen from the hill. Packs were lowered. The wounded trader was placed beneath a cloak stretched between two rocks. No one lit a fire. The cavalrymen moved south in search of a crossing. 2 legionaries crawled forward to observe the enclosure. Marcus waited among the wet heather. The day faded slowly. Smoke above the hill turned blue against the darkening sky. Once, carried by the wind, came the lowing of cattle. Then he heard something else. Voices, many of them, indistinct but not raised in celebration. The scouts returned at dusk. The old enclosure held perhaps 60 people, most of them families from the abandoned farms. Armed men guarded the approach, but the captives were not bound. No Roman patrol was visible. No one appeared to be preparing an attack. "There is arguing," one scout said. "The guards quarrel among themselves." Coletus listened carefully. "Then they are not one group," he said. Crispus looked towards the hill. In the last light, a lone figure emerged from the enclosure and began descending the narrow path. The guards did not stop him. He carried no shield, only a staff with a strip of pale cloth tied beneath its head. The figure crossed the lower field and halted at the river bank. Even at that distance it was clear that he had come to speak. Crispus selected Marcus, Coletus, and 4 others to accompany him. They left their packs behind and descended towards the water, while darkness gathered over the frontier hills and the river moved between the 2 parties, broad, cold, and shining beneath the rain. The river was deeper than it had appeared from the ridge. Its surface moved darkly beneath the rain, folding around stones and carrying thin branches downstream. Crispus led the small party along the bank until they found a place where the water widened and slowed. The man on the opposite side waited without moving, his pale strip of cloth lifting faintly in the wind. Coletus cupped his hands around his mouth and called to him in the northern tongue. The reply came quickly. "They will speak," Coletus translated, "but only with 6 men, no bows, no horses." Crispus looked across the river. "Ask who commands them." Coletus called again. This time the answer took longer. "He says no one commands them all." That confirmed what the scouts had seen. The people in the enclosure were not a single war band. They were several groups held together by fear, necessity, or disagreement. Crispus ordered 2 soldiers to remain on the eastern bank. He, Marcus, Coletus, and 3 others entered the water. Cold closed around Marcus's ankles, then his knees. The current pressed against his legs, stronger near the center. He held his shield above the surface and tested each step with the butt of his spear. Stones shifted beneath his sandals. Once he slipped and felt water surge to his waist, but Crispus caught his arm before the current could turn him. They reached the opposite bank, soaked below the belt. The waiting man was older than Marcus had expected. Gray threaded his beard, and rain shone upon a face lined by weather. He wore a heavy cloak fastened with an iron pin. No sword hung at his side, though a small knife rested in his belt. "My name is Brennus," he said in careful Latin. "I speak for those who will listen." Crispus did not smile. "And the others? They speak for themselves." The old man led them uphill. The path twisted between rocks and thorn bushes, steep enough that Marcus's wet sandals slipped twice. Above, the enclosure walls rose from the ridge like the remains of an older world. They had been built without mortar, great stones fitted together and darkened by moss. Time had lowered them, but the entrance remained narrow. 2 armed men watched from either side. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, wet wool, cattle, and too many people crowded into too little space. Families filled the ruined enclosure. Some sat beneath hide shelters stretched against the walls. Others crouched around small fires. Children slept wrapped in cloaks, while women stirred pots or tended bundles of belongings. Sheep pressed together near one corner. Several cattle stood tethered beneath an ash tree, their hides steaming faintly in the damp evening. The scene was not that of an army preparing for war. It was a village uprooted and carried onto a hill. Marcus saw the bone comb almost at once. A young woman near the nearest fire had one of the same design tucked into her hair. Beside her sat a boy with mud to his elbows, staring openly at the Roman helmets. The armed men were scattered among the families. Some carried spears. A few had round shields of painted wood. One wore a Roman military belt, old and badly mended, perhaps traded, inherited, or taken years before. None stood in formation. Brennus brought Crispus to the center of the enclosure, where 3 other men waited. One was tall, broad, and young, with a red cloak over his shoulders. His hand rested upon the hilt of a long sword. Another was narrow-faced and plainly dressed, his expression tired rather than hostile. The third was Iogon's age, with a scar across his chin and rain dripping from his hair. The young man spoke first. "You crossed the wall armed," Crispus answered evenly. "You drove people from farms near Rome's frontier." "They came with us." A murmur rose from the families nearby. Brennus turned his head sharply. "Some came." The young man's face hardened. Calidas spoke to him in their own language. The exchange was quick and bitter. Marcus understood none of the words, but he recognized accusation. "What is happening?" Crispus asked. Calidas kept his eyes on the young man. "There is a feud farther east. A leader named Caraticos was killed. His kin blame a Western household. The dead man's brother is gathering followers. These farms lie between them." "And these people were taken for protection?" "Some were moved for protection," Brennus said. "Some were forced because they would not leave." The narrow-faced man added something. Calidas translated. "He says the eastern group has already burned 2 storehouses. Winter grain is being destroyed." Crispus looked around the enclosure. "Then why bring the families here?" "To keep them beyond the reach of both sides," Brennus replied. The young man laughed without humor. "He brought them here so Rome would hear their crying and send soldiers." Brennus faced him. "And you brought them because you wanted their cattle." The enclosure became suddenly quiet. Rain hissed upon the fires. Marcus watched the armed men shift their weight. This was the dangerous moment. Not a charge across open ground, but a breath in which pride might outrun reason. Crispus lowered his spear until its point rested against the earth. "We came because farms were empty, and a traitor lay bleeding in the valley. We did not come to choose your leaders." The scarred man spoke rapidly. Kalidas listened, then said, "He claims Iogen was struck by men from the eastern ridge." Brennus shook his head. "Men wearing eastern cloaks." "Does the difference matter to the man who was left to die?" Crispus asked. No one answered. A child began crying near the wall. His mother drew him beneath her cloak and rocked him gently. Crispus looked from one spokesman to another. "At dawn, the families will be allowed to decide where they go. Those who wish to return south will be escorted to the frontier. Those who remain do so freely. The cattle taken from the farms go with their owners." The young man stepped forward. "You give orders here?" "I give the conditions under which Roman soldiers leave without calling more soldiers." The words were calm, almost quiet, yet they carried across the enclosure. Marcus felt the men beside him become still. No threat had been described. None was necessary. Everyone present knew that a patrol could be followed by a century, and a century by something larger. Rome's strength lay not only in the soldiers on the hill, but in the roads, forts, granaries, messages, and organized weight behind them. Brennus nodded first. The narrow-faced man followed. The scarred man hesitated, then gave a short assent. Only the young leader remained silent. At last he lifted his hand from his sword. "The families may choose," he said. Crispus inclined his head. The meeting ended without ceremony. The Romans were given a place beside the outer wall, away from the cattle and close enough to the entrance that no one could accuse them of creeping through the enclosure at night. They were offered a pot of hot broth made with barley, leeks, and mutton. Crispus accepted, for refusing food could insult people whose agreement was still fragile. Marcus sat upon a flat stone with steam rising from the wooden bowl between his hands. Around him, the displaced families settled uneasily beneath their shelters. Low conversations moved through the darkness. Someone sang a child to sleep in a language he did not know. Near the far wall, two men argued until Brennus silenced them. Kalidas sat beside Marcus. "Will they keep their word?" Marcus asked. "Until morning." "And after?" Kalidas looked toward the young man in the red cloak, who stood alone beside the cattle. "Morning is sometimes enough." The rain weakened at last. Through a break in the clouds, a few stars appeared above the ruined wall. Marcus thought of the fort, its straight streets and barred gates, and of Livia sleeping beyond them. Here, only a day's march away, the world seemed governed by kinship, memory, livestock, and promises made beside smoky fires. Yet, as he watched a woman spread her cloak over two sleeping children, he understood that the distance between the two worlds was smaller than Rome liked to imagine. Before lying down, he found a gray feather caught among the stones near the wall. It was damp and ordinary, perhaps dropped by a crow. He placed it carefully inside his pack. The feather remained inside Marcus's pack when the enclosure began to wake. Dawn came slowly over the ridge, first as a pale thinning of the darkness, then as a band of cold light beneath the eastern clouds. Fires stirred back to life. Cattle shifted against their ropes. Somewhere near the wall, a child coughed, and a woman murmured until the sound ceased. Marcus had slept only in fragments. Each time he opened his eyes, he found the ruined stones above him and the dim shapes of armed men standing watch. Yet the night had passed without violence. Crispus rose before the others and walked to the center of the enclosure. He spoke first with Brennus, then with the three men who had argued the evening before. Their voices remained low. No one drew a weapon. The families were gathered after sunrise. There was no formal council, no raised platform, no clerk recording decisions. People stood among their bundles and animals while the old man repeated the agreement in their own tongue. Those who wished to return south could go under Roman escort. Those who chose to remain would not be prevented. Cattle and sheep were to follow the households that claimed them. At first, no one moved. Marcus understood the hesitation. A choice made before neighbors and armed kinsmen was never entirely free. Each person had to consider not only the road ahead, but who would remember the decision afterward. Then an elderly woman stepped from the crowd. She carried a spindle in one hand and held the wrist of a girl with the other. She spoke briefly to Brennus, pointed south, and went to gather her bedding. Others followed. A family with 2 small children untied 3 sheep. A lame man loaded baskets onto a pony. The young woman with the bone comb chose to return, though her brother, an armed man in a brown cloak, remained behind. They embraced without words. Not everyone went. Several households preferred to stay within the protection of the hill. Some feared the feud had spread too close to their farms. Others had relatives farther west. A few simply distrusted the Romans more than the men around them. The young leader in the red cloak watched the division with a tight, unreadable expression. He did not interfere. By mid-morning, nearly 30 people had formed a loose group beside the entrance. They carried blankets, cooking pots, grain sacks, tools, and infants wrapped against the wind. 7 cattle and more than a dozen sheep crowded the path. Progress would be slow. Crispus sent a runner back to the river with orders for the rest of the patrol. The wounded trader was carried uphill so he could identify the men who had attacked him. Iogen studied every face within the enclosure. His gaze lingered upon the young leader's followers, but he recognized no one with certainty. "They covered their hair," he said, "and rain was in my eyes." The answer satisfied no one, yet uncertainty was better than a false accusation spoken before men already divided by suspicion. One object was returned to him, the bronze pin shaped like a bird. It had been found beneath a hide shelter among goods gathered from the road. No one admitted placing it there. Iogen turned it over in his hand. "My daughter made me buy this," he said. "She said no trader should wear an ugly cloak pin." He fastened it carefully beneath his shoulder. The procession left the enclosure before noon. Marcus walked near the rear, where the path was narrowest. The families moved quietly, saving breath for the descent. Sheep resisted every turn. The cattle stopped to pull at wet grass. Children stumbled, recovered, and stared at the Roman soldiers with solemn curiosity. The river crossing took a long time. Ropes were stretched between the banks. Packs were passed hand to hand. The smaller children were carried on soldiers' shoulders, some laughing despite the cold, others gripping helmets in silence. A calf refused the water until its mother crossed first. Marcus helped the elderly woman with the spindle. She was lighter than he expected, though her cloak and skirts grew heavy in the current. She said something to him when they reached the far bank. He looked at Calidas. "She says you walk badly." Marcus glanced down at his soaked sandals. "She is right." For the first time that day, Calidas smiled. They followed the valley southeast, retracing their route towards the abandoned farms. Rain threatened, but did not fall. The clouds traveled high and fast, allowing sunlight to pass in brief, bright intervals over the hills. At midday, they stopped near a spring. The soldiers distributed grain cakes and cheese. The returning families shared dried meat, hazelnuts, and a thick oat bread. No one spoke of sides or treaties. Hunger made a temporary community of them. A boy sat near Marcus and examined his shield. He traced the painted curve without touching it, then pointed to the iron boss at the center. "For the hand," Marcus said, showing him the grip behind it. The boy understood little Latin, but the purpose was clear. He nodded seriously and demonstrated with an imaginary shield of his own. His mother called him back. By evening, they reached the abandoned roundhouse where the patrol had camped. Its owners were among the returning group, the young woman with the comb, her mother, 2 children, and a quiet man who walked with a shepherd's staff. They entered the enclosure slowly. The open gate, the cold hearth, and the scattered household objects seemed to strike them more deeply than the journey had. The woman picked up the broken spindle from the floor. Her mother stood in the doorway, looking at the roof as though she had expected to find it burned. Nothing had been destroyed. The hearth was relit. Animals were counted. A missing storage jar was discovered behind the house, cracked but usable. Before long, smoke rose once more from the roof opening. Other families continued towards farms farther south. Crispus divided the patrol again, assigning small escorts to each route. The countryside that had seemed deserted the previous day began to fill with movement. Cattle along tracks, voices across fields, doors opened to the evening air. Marcus remained at the first farm with 6 soldiers until darkness. The family offered them shelter inside, but Crispus chose the enclosure. Trust had been restored only enough for ordinary caution. Marcus sat beneath the wall, repairing a strap by firelight. The young boy appeared and placed a wooden cup beside him. It contained warm milk. Marcus lifted it in thanks. The boy pointed north, then to Marcus's sword. "No," Marcus said gently, "not tonight." The boy considered this and sat beside him. Above them, smoke drifted into the clear sky. Somewhere beyond the hills, the feud remained unresolved. Its causes carried in memories Marcus would never fully know. Rome had not ended it. The patrol had not captured its leaders or imposed a lasting peace. Yet families had returned to their hearths. Grain remained in the ground. Cattle stood once more within familiar fences. On the frontier, such small outcomes were often the nearest thing to victory. Marcus drank the milk while the fire settled into red coals, and for a little while the boy beside him watched the sparks rise as though no wall divided the world at all. The sparks thinned and vanished into the dark. When the boy's mother called him inside, Marcus returned the empty cup and watched the hide curtain fall across the doorway. Warm light escaped for a moment around its edges. Within, the family spoke softly as they arranged bedding and settled the youngest child near the hearth. Outside, the soldiers prepared for the night. They placed 2 sentries beyond the enclosure and slept in turns beneath their cloaks. The ground was still damp, but the sky remained clear. Without clouds to hold the day's warmth, the air sharpened quickly. Frost silvered the grass before dawn. Marcus woke with one hand beneath his neck and the other resting upon his shield. The farm lay quiet. Smoke no longer rose from the roof, though a faint red glow showed through the entrance. In the eastern sky, the stars were fading. For a while, he listened. There were no hurried hoofbeats, no distant calls, no warning from the sentries. Only sheep shifting behind the stone fence and the low murmur of the stream below the hill. Crispus returned after sunrise with the men who had escorted the other families home. All had reached their farms without resistance. One storehouse had been opened and part of its grain removed, but the damage was less than feared. No armed group had followed them from the western enclosure. The centurion accepted a bowl of oat porridge from the household and ate it standing beside the gate. "We return to the wall," he said when he had finished. The order brought quiet relief. The patrol gathered slowly. Packs were tightened. The litter for Iogen was strengthened with fresh branches. The trader could now stand for a short time, though each movement caused pain beneath his bandages. He insisted upon walking a few steps before allowing himself to be lifted again. "I have crossed these hills for 20 years," he said. "I will not be carried past every stone." Kalidas looked at him. "You may choose which stones witness your pride." Iogen lay back upon the litter. Before Marcus left, the boy from the previous night approached with his mother. He held something cupped in both hands. When he opened them, Marcus saw a small carved bead made from pale antler. A line wound around it in a simple spiral. The mother spoke, and Kalidas translated. "For bringing them home." Marcus shook his head and tried to refuse. The family could not possess many things without use. Yet the woman closed his fingers around the bead and stepped away. He placed it in the same pouch as Flavia's feather. The patrol took the southern path. With no need to follow uncertain tracks, the guides chose firmer ground along the ridges. The route was longer but easier. From the heights, Marcus could see far across the country. Dark woodland gathered in valleys, smoke from scattered farms, pale water lying among the marshes, and hills fading northward beneath the morning haze. It was a beautiful land when the rain stopped. This surprised him each time he noticed it. For years he had described Britain in letters as cold, wet, and distant. All three were true, yet truth could be incomplete. There were autumn mornings when every blade of grass shone. There were summer evenings when light remained in the sky long after supper. There were quiet valleys where birch leaves trembled over clear water, and no road, fort, or quarrel seemed to matter. The empire had taught Marcus to measure country by distance marched, grain required, and places suitable for camps. The frontier taught him that a landscape could never be contained entirely within such measurements. Near midday, they stopped beside a cluster of standing stones. The stones were older than any Roman work in Britain, weathered and leaning, their purpose forgotten or transformed by generations. Kalidas said people still left small offerings there, though he did not explain to whom. At the base of one stone lay a twist of wool, several hazelnut shells, and a clay cup filled with rainwater. The soldiers rested at a respectful distance. Marcus ate one of Livia's oatcakes. It had hardened in his pack, but the mint still scented the cloth. He broke off a small piece and considered placing it near the stone. Then he smiled at himself and ate it instead. By afternoon, clouds had returned. They reached the crest of a long ridge and saw the wall. At first it appeared as a pale thread across the southern hills. Then the towers became visible, and after them the roofs of the fort beyond. Smoke rose from the bathhouse and workshops. Tiny figures moved along the rampart. The sight changed the patrol's pace. Men adjusted their packs and spoke more freely. Publius began describing the meal he hoped to eat, naming foods unlikely to be available. Lucius promised that the cookhouse would offer cabbage and barley and nothing else. Titus argued that, After 2 wet nights, even cabbage could possess dignity. Marcus said little. The fort looked different from the north. From within, its walls seemed defensive and enclosing. From this side, after days among uncertain paths, it appeared orderly, warm, and almost welcoming. The road led clearly towards it. The gate stood exactly where expected. Watchmen paced above the arch with measured steps. A horn sounded from the tower. The patrol had been seen. They approached before dusk. The sentries called down, questions were answered, and the heavy doors opened inward. Kalidas entered first with the rescued pony. Behind him came the legionaries, auxiliaries, guides, Eogan upon his litter, and the tired horses. Inside, the familiar smells met Marcus all at once: smoke, bread, leather, drains, horse dung, iron, and cooking fat. Men emerged from barracks to watch. A clerk hurried from headquarters. The medical orderlies took charge of Eogan and carried him towards the hospital. No crowd cheered. Patrols departed and returned often. The empire's frontier was maintained not by constant ceremony, but by reports delivered, tracks followed, gates opened, and exhausted men placing equipment back in its proper place. Crispus went directly to the headquarters building. The rest were dismissed to their barracks. Marcus removed his shield, helmet, spear, belt, and mail. Without their weight, he felt strangely unsteady. His tunic was stiff with dried rain and sweat. Mud had worked beneath the edges of his sandals despite every strap. Titus examined the room. "Nothing stolen," he said. "By whom?" Publius asked. "Men left behind in a fort with access to our blankets and no moral guidance." Lucius lifted a small jar from beneath his sleeping platform. "My fish sauce remains." "No one wanted it," Marcus said. The laughter that followed was weary but genuine. They ate an early supper and carried their clothes to be washed. The bathhouse was crowded with soldiers finishing duty. Steam gathered beneath the vaulted roof. Voices echoed from stone and plaster. Marcus passed through the warm room and into the hot chamber, where heat entered his tired muscles so deeply that he had to sit upon the bench. Oil, smoke, wet stone, and human bodies scented the thick air. Men scraped dirt from their skin with curved strigils, complained about patrol assignments, exchanged gossip, and argued over dice games that had not yet happened. Publius lowered himself into the water with a sigh. "This," he said, "is why Rome built the empire." "No," Lucius replied. "Rome built the empire so you could complain in several provinces." Marcus leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. The river, the ruined enclosure, and the cold hills seemed already far away. Yet, behind his eyelids, he could still see the returning families crossing the water, children held above the current, and smoke rising again from the abandoned farm. Later, clean and wrapped in a dry cloak, he left the fort through the eastern gate. Evening lamps glowed in the settlement. A baker was closing his shutters. From an inn came the sound of a reed pipe, and several voices singing without agreement. Dogs nosed among the roadside scraps. Livia's father saw Marcus first. He stood in the workshop doorway, trimming a strip of leather. He nodded once, then looked over his shoulder. Flavia ran out so quickly that one shoe came loose. Marcus knelt and caught her against him. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." "Did you find it?" He opened his pouch and removed the gray feather. During the journey, it had dried slightly bent, with one edge ruffled. Flavia received it as though it had come from the tail of an eagle. "A northern feather," Marcus told her. She held it towards the lamplight. Livia waited in the doorway. There were questions in her face, but she did not ask them until Marcus had entered, eaten, and warmed his hands beside the hearth. Flavia placed the feather among her stones and carried the antler bead around the room on a string. Marcus told Livia only what mattered. Farms abandoned, a wounded trader, families returned, no battle. She listened while mending the hem of a child's tunic. When he had finished, she set the garment aside and touched the bruise on his wrist where Crispus had caught him in the river. "You trusted the ground," she said. "The river this time." Outside, rain began lightly upon the roof. Marcus sat beside the fire with Flavia asleep against his shoulder and Livia's hand resting near his on the bench. For one night, the trumpet, the wall, and the unsettled hills beyond it seemed distant enough to belong to another man's life. Morning returned the other man's life to him. The trumpet sounded from within the fort before the eastern sky had fully brightened. Its note traveled over tiled roofs and muddy lanes, through shutters, across hearth smoke, and into the small room where Marcus sat awake with Flavia's head still resting against his arm. He had slept little, not because of danger, but because the quiet had felt too precious to surrender. The fire had burned down slowly while rain passed over the settlement. Livia had gone to bed, and Marcus had remained on the bench, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the soft shifting of timber, the faint hiss of damp logs, the breathing of his daughter. Now duty called from beyond the gate. He lifted Flavia carefully and placed her beneath the woolen blanket beside Livia. The gray feather lay on the floor near the hearth, where it had slipped from the child's hand. Marcus set it upon the shelf with her colored stones. Livia opened her eyes. "You have not rested." "I rested here." "That is not the same." "No," he said. "It is better." She smiled without fully waking. Marcus fastened his cloak, stepped into the wet dawn, and followed the other soldiers returning from the settlement. Bakers were already carrying baskets towards the fort. A cart loaded with firewood waited at the gate while the driver argued over a tally mark. Smoke drifted low beneath the clouds. Inside, the 6th Legion resumed its measured rhythm. The patrol's report had reached the commander during the night. Crispus and the decurion had described the abandoned farms, the wounded trader, the gathering in the hill enclosure, and the return of the families. The names of local leaders were recorded. Messengers would carry portions of the report east and west along the frontier. Scouts would continue watching the northern tracks. For Marcus and the others, however, the first order was ordinary. Clean the equipment. Mud had dried in every seam. Shield covers required brushing and oiling. Mail shirts were rubbed with cloth and fine sand to keep rust from taking hold. Sword blades were wiped, examined, and greased lightly. Leather straps were softened with fat. Tent pieces and cloaks were spread beneath an awning where the wind could reach them. The work lasted most of the morning. Publius complained that half the weight of his armor had been northern soil. Titus replied that Britain was attempting to reclaim Roman property one handful at a time. Marcus sat upon a low stool with his mail across his knees. As he worked oil into the links, he watched the fort around him. A detail of men repaired a drain beside the granary. Recruits practiced commands near the headquarters. 2 clerks crossed the street carrying tablets sealed for dispatch. A veterinary orderly examined the hoof of a cavalry horse. Nothing had changed while he was away. And yet this was not quite true. The fort contained memory. Every returning patrol brought knowledge that altered maps, duties, suspicions, and expectations. An empty farm might lead to more scouts. A disputed herd might change relations with a local leader. A wounded trader might cause a gate to close earlier for weeks. Empires were shaped by decrees, taxes, roads, and armies, but they were also shaped by details written in small hands upon wax. Near midday, Crispus summoned Marcus to the headquarters building. The Principia stood at the center of the fort, arranged around a paved courtyard. Standards and official business were kept there. Clerks worked in side rooms where shelves held records of pay, supplies, assignments, punishments, and correspondence. The building smelled of wax, ink, wood smoke, and damp stone. Marcus waited beneath the covered walkway until Crispus emerged. Beside the centurion stood a thin man in a clean military cloak. Marcus knew him as Julius Marcellus, one of the senior clerks attached to the commander's staff. "You found this?" Marcellus asked. He held the bone comb Marcus had picked up in the valley. "Yes." "Where exactly?" Marcus described the place. Beneath the fern, close to the scattered fire, several paces from the stream. The clerk turned the comb over. Its decoration was plain, though one edge bore a mark Marcus had not noticed, a set of tiny cut lines crossing one another. "Iogen says it is not his," Marcus added. "It belongs to a woman from the eastern farms," Crispus said. "Her family has not returned." Marcus looked at him. "How many are missing?" "6 people from 2 households." The peaceful ending of the patrol shifted slightly in his mind. Were they at the enclosure? No one remembers seeing them. Marcellus wrapped the comb in cloth. This may mean nothing. They may have gone to relatives, but another patrol leaves tomorrow. Marcus understood before the order was spoken. "You will go with them," Crispus said. "You saw the trail. You know the ground." There was no anger in Marcus, only the quiet sinking of expectation. Soldiers were often chosen for a duty because they had already performed it once. Knowledge became obligation. "How long?" 3 days, if the weather holds." Marcus thought of Livia's face at dawn, and of Flavia's feather upon the shelf. "Yes, centurion." He was dismissed. Outside, sunlight had broken through the clouds. It shone upon the wet courtyard, turning every stone bright. Marcus stood for a moment beneath the colonnade while men passed around him with baskets, tablets, and rolled cloaks. Tomorrow he would cross the wall again. But the remainder of this day still belonged to the fort. After the midday meal, he drew his pay account from the clerk's office. Deductions had been made for food, clothing, and equipment, as was customary. The numbers were written clearly, though Marcus suspected that no soldier had ever looked upon a deduction without believing it too large. He set aside a few coins for Livia and kept one for the bathhouse and wine shop. Then the century assembled for drill. The ground had softened in the rain. Wooden swords struck practice posts. Shields knocked together. Commands carried across the yard. Marcus moved through the familiar steps until thought fell away, and only the body remained. Advance, guard, thrust, recover. The repetition calmed him. At sunset, he returned to the settlement. Livia was waiting outside the workshop, scraping mud from a hide stretched upon a frame. She saw the meaning in his face before he spoke. "Again?" "Tomorrow." "How far?" "I do not know yet." Flavia sat nearby with the antler bead tied around her wrist. She was drawing lines in the mud with the northern feather. Marcus crouched beside her. "I need to borrow that," he said. She covered the feather with both hands. "It is mine." "It is, but I may need it to find the north." Flavia studied him gravely, uncertain whether this was a joke. At last she handed it over. "You must bring it back." Marcus tucked the feather inside his cloak. "I will." Livia had heard promises before. She said nothing, but when he stood, she stepped close and fastened the cloak more firmly at his throat. Above the roofs, the evening sky had cleared to a deep, cold blue. Beyond the settlement, the wall stretched across the hills, pale in the final light. Marcus looked towards it, while Flavia's feather rested against his chest, light enough to be forgotten and impossible not to feel. Before dawn, Marcus returned the feather to Flavia. She had fallen asleep with one hand curled around the antler bead. He placed the feather beside her pillow and watched it stir in the warm breath rising from beneath the blanket. Livia stood near the hearth, grinding grain in the dim light. Neither of them spoke until Marcus had tightened the last strap on his pack. 3 days, she said, if the weather holds. The weather never agrees to anything. Marcus smiled, though only briefly. Outside, frost whitened the roofs. The settlement was silent except for a baker opening his oven and the distant creak of the fort gate. Marcus crossed the road, passed beneath the arch, and entered the ordered darkness within. The new patrol was smaller than the first. 12 legionaries waited in the headquarters courtyard, accompanied by 4 auxiliaries, a medical orderly, and a scout named Vorenus, who had spent many years traveling between the forts and northern communities. Kalidas was not among them. He had remained near the hospital until Iogen could walk, then departed west with messages for several households. Marcus recognized half the men. Titus had been assigned again, as had Publius, whose expression suggested that the North had personally offended him. The officer in command was Optio Decimus Sabinus, deputy to a centurion from another century. Sabinus was a narrow, patient man who rarely raised his voice. He checked every pack himself, then unfolded a wax tablet beneath the light of a lamp. "We searched 2 farmsteads east of the valley," he said. 6 people are missing. We find signs of where they went. We do not pursue beyond the marked ridge without sending word. He looked from face to face. This is a search, not a march against an enemy. The distinction mattered. Soon after sunrise, the gate opened and the patrol crossed the wall. The cold had hardened the mud along the road, making the first miles easier. Their breath smoked before them. Grass snapped beneath their sandals. Above the eastern hills, the sun appeared as a pale red disk behind thin cloud. Vorenus led them along a route Marcus had not traveled before. It followed a line of higher ground, passing low burial mounds and scattered stones set upright in the turf. Ravens watched from a leafless oak, their feathers shining blue-black whenever they moved. By midday, the frost had softened. The path turned northeast across a broad stretch of moor. Here, the wind met them without obstruction. It carried the smell of peat and distant smoke, though no farm was visible. Marcus walked beside Titus. 6 people, Titus said. How does an entire household disappear without anyone noticing? People noticed. Afterward. Marcus adjusted the shield strap across his shoulder. On the frontier, afterward is often when noticing begins. They reached the first farm in the afternoon. Its enclosure stood beside a shallow stream. The gate remained closed. No animals called from within. Sabinus signaled the patrol to halt. 2 men circled the outer wall while Marcus and Titus approached the entrance. A wooden latch had been lifted and placed carefully on a stone. There was no sign of force. Inside, the house was empty. The hearth had been swept. Cooking pots were gone. Bedding had been removed from the sleeping places. A bundle of kindling remained dry beneath the roof, and several clay jars stood open along the wall. This departure had not been hurried. Vorenus examined the storage pit and found it nearly empty. The missing family had taken grain, tools, clothing, and whatever else could be carried. They planned to leave, Publius said. Or someone planned for them, Titus replied. Behind the house, Marcus found wheel tracks leading east. They were shallow but clear where the ground remained soft beneath the trees. A small cart had passed, drawn by a single animal. The tracks joined a wider path beyond the stream. Sabinus ordered 2 men to remain at the farm, while the others continued towards the second household. They found it less than a mile away. This farm had not been abandoned neatly. The gate sagged from one hinge. A jar lay shattered outside the doorway. Ash from the hearth had been scattered across the floor as though someone had kicked through it. A child's woolen shoe rested near the wall. Marcus picked it up. The leather sole was worn thin at the heel. A faded red thread had been sewn around the opening. The comb came from this household, Vorenus said. He pointed to a low wooden chest. Its lid stood open. Inside were several bone pins carved with the same pattern of circles Marcus had seen near the valley. Sabinus searched the enclosure carefully. 3 different sets of tracks crossed the yard. One belonged to bare feet or soft shoes. Another had the narrow heel of local boots. The third showed hobnails, Roman hobnails. Marcus crouched beside the marks. The pattern was not identical to his own, but the broad outline was familiar. A soldier's sandal had stood near the doorway, then crossed towards the gate. Publius stared at the print. Someone from the fort? Or someone wearing sandals traded from the fort, Sabinus said. Military equipment moved beyond military hands. Old boots, belts, buckles, and blades were sold, lost, stolen, repaired, and passed from one owner to another. A Roman mark did not prove a Roman presence. Yet it was enough to make the patrol more cautious. Near the stream, they found cart tracks matching those at the first farm. The missing households had probably traveled together, willingly or otherwise. The trail continued east. Cloud gathered as the afternoon faded. The wind shifted north and sharpened. Sabinus considered returning to the first farm for shelter, but Vorenus warned that rain would swell the stream overnight and blur the tracks. They followed while light remained. The path descended into open ground where low pools lay among reeds. Cartwheels had cut deeply here. Once the animal pulling the load had stumbled, leaving a long mark in the mud. Marcus saw smaller footprints beside it. Children had walked behind the cart. No blood marked the path. No discarded rope suggested bonds. Yet the second farm's broken gate remained in his thoughts. At dusk, the trail reached an old track running north and south. The wheel marks turned south, towards the wall. The patrol halted. Behind them lay the missing farms. Ahead, the path led not deeper into northern country, but towards Rome's frontier, passing several miles east of their own fort. Sabinus studied the ground until darkness made study useless. They were taken south, Publius said. Or they chose to go south, Vorenus replied. Why avoid the gate? Vorenus looked towards the low hills. Because not every crossing is watched equally. They camped beside a stand of pines. No fires were lit. The men ate cold bread and bacon beneath their cloaks, while sentries listened along the track. Marcus lay awake, staring through branches at a narrow strip of clouded sky. The missing families might already be within Roman territory. It was an unsettling thought. Beyond the wall, danger could be named as distance, feud, or uncertain loyalty. South of it lay roads, patrols, officials, and law. But law did not illuminate every path, and a wall could keep watch only over those who passed through its gates. Before first light, the sentry heard wheels. The sound came faintly along the southern track. A wooden creak, a pause, then the dull turning of a cart over frozen ground. Sabinus woke the patrol without a trumpet or shouted order. Men rose beneath the pines, fastened belts, lifted shields, and moved into the darkness on either side of the path. Marcus crouched behind a fallen trunk where needles and damp earth scented the cold air. The wheels drew nearer. A mule appeared first, its head lowered beneath a rough harness. Behind it rolled a narrow cart covered with hides. A single man walked beside the animal, carrying a staff. He wore a hooded cloak and moved with the weary care of someone who had traveled through the night. Sabinus stepped into the road. The mule stopped. The driver froze, then raised both hands. "Where have you come from?" Sabinus asked. The man answered in poor Latin, naming a settlement east of the wall. Vorenus questioned him in the local tongue. His replies came quickly. He was carrying smoked fish and wool south to a market near the military road. He had seen another cart the previous evening, larger and heavily loaded. 2 men walked beside it. Several people followed on foot, including children. "Were they guarded?" Vorenus asked. The trader considered. One man had a spear, the others did not. Did the families seem afraid? Another pause. They seemed tired. The cart had turned west at an old earthwork several miles south of the frontier. Sabinus allowed the trader to continue after inspecting the load. Beneath the hides were baskets of fish packed with salt and bundles of coarse wool. Nothing suggested deceit. Dawn revealed the land slowly. The patrol followed the southern path. Frost glittered along the reeds, and thin ice cracked beneath their sandals at the edges of shallow pools. The wall was not visible from the low ground, but Marcus sensed its nearness in the changing landscape. Tracks multiplied. More carts had passed. Small fields appeared behind banks of earth. Smoke rose from farmsteads whose occupants had learned to live beneath Roman authority without becoming Roman. By mid-morning they found the old earthwork. It was a broad bank and ditch, older than the wall and softened by grass. The missing cart had turned west exactly as the trader had said. Its wheels had broken the frost upon a narrow lane leading towards a wooded valley. Vorenus knelt beside the prince. 2 days old. Sabinus studied the sky. And no rain since. They continued. The lane crossed a stream by a timber bridge and entered woodland. Oak and hazel grew close together, their branches bare. Last summer's leaves lay thick beneath the trees, hiding the harder ground. For a while the trail vanished. The patrol spread out. Marcus searched among the leaves, looking for broken twigs, fresh mud, or impressions where the cartwheels had pressed through. Near a moss-covered stone, he found a length of faded red thread caught upon a thorn. It matched the stitching around the child's shoe. He held it up. The trail turned northwest, then ended at a cluster of buildings hidden in the valley. The place was not a village. It was a roadside estate of modest size, a timber house upon a stone foundation, 2 barns, animal pens, and several workshops arranged around a muddy yard. Smoke rose from a kiln. Men moved beneath an open shed, shaping clay on low wheels. Sabinus halted the patrol behind the trees. A Roman-style tiled roof covered a part of the main house, though the remaining buildings were roofed with thatch. The arrangement suggested a local owner who had adopted some southern habits while keeping older methods. Such estates were common enough near the frontier, supplying food, pottery, wool, timber, and labor to military communities. A cart stood near the largest barn. One wheel bore fresh mud. Marcus recognized its narrow track. No one in the yard appeared armed. A woman carried firewood between the house and kiln. Two children chased each other near the pens. A man in a leather apron stirred a clay mixture in a trough. Sabinus chose 4 soldiers and approached openly. Marcus went with him. Dogs barked before they crossed the yard. The man at the trough looked up, dropped his tool, and shouted towards the house. An older woman emerged first. She wore a dark blue dress beneath a heavy cloak and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A bronze keyring hung from her belt. She spoke fluent Latin. "You are far from the road." "So are the people whose cart came here," Sabinus replied. The woman's expression did not change. "Travelers come here often." 6 people from 2 farms north of the wall. At this, she looked towards the barn. The movement was slight, but Marcus saw it. Sabinus saw it too. "Bring them out." The woman folded her hands. "They are not prisoners. Then they may speak for themselves." For several breaths, no one moved. At last, she called a name. The barn door opened. A man stepped into the yard, followed by a woman carrying an infant. Behind them came another woman, 2 children, and an elderly man leaning upon a stick. All 6 were alive. The younger child wore only 1 shoe. The other foot had been wrapped in cloth. Marcus felt the tension leave his shoulders, though questions remained. Vorenus spoke to the families. Their answers came hesitantly at first, then with greater certainty. They had known the woman who owned the estate through trade. Her name was Aelia Cata, daughter of a local landholder who had received Roman citizenship years earlier. They had come south by choice. The feud beyond the wall had made their farms unsafe. One household had packed quietly. The other had been interrupted by armed relatives who tried to prevent them from leaving, causing the broken gate and scattered hearth. A worker from the estate, wearing old military sandals, had helped them escape. "Why avoid the gates?" Sabinus asked. Aelia answered, "Because the northern men watch them, and because your officials ask for names, taxes, and reasons. Fear does not always arrive carrying the correct tablets." Sabinus's face remained stern. Crossing the frontier secretly creates other fears. "Yes," she said, "that is why I expected soldiers." The families intended to remain at the estate through winter. In exchange for food and shelter, they would work with sheep, clay, and timber. Their decision was practical, but not without cost. Land abandoned too long might be claimed by others. Kin might call them disloyal. Returning north could become difficult. The woman whose comb Marcus had found spoke quietly to Vorenus. He translated. She dropped it when they rested near the stream. She asks whether it was found. Marcus removed the wrapped comb from his pouch. The woman's face softened when he gave it to her. She ran her thumb over the carved circles, then placed it carefully in her hair. The child with 1 shoe stared at Marcus's sandals. He crouched and examined the wrapped foot. The cloth was damp, and the skin beneath had reddened from walking. The medical orderly cleaned it and supplied a strip of soft leather for a temporary sole. No crime had been discovered. No captives required rescue. Yet Sabinus did not consider the search wasted. He recorded the names of the 6 people and Aelia's account upon a wax tablet. He warned that the hidden crossing would be watched more closely. Aelia accepted this with a small nod, as if she had already calculated the inconvenience. Before the patrol left, she offered bread, warm ale, and a place beside the kiln to dry their cloaks. Sabinus allowed a brief rest. Marcus sat beneath the workshop roof, holding a wooden cup while heat drifted from the kiln. The missing families moved through the yard behind him, uncertain but no longer lost. One woman began sorting wool. The elderly man repaired a basket. The children watched clay rise between the potter's hands. South of the wall, their lives had not become simple. They had merely entered a different arrangement of risks. Marcus thought of the frontier as he had seen it from the rampart. A stone line across the hills, clear enough to divide a map. Here, in the sheltered valley, that line seemed less certain. People crossed it for trade, marriage, fear, work, refuge, and opportunity. Soldiers watched the gates, but life moved through older paths beneath the trees. When the patrol departed, the woman with the comb stood beside the barn. She raised one hand in farewell. Marcus answered with the same quiet gesture. Then the soldiers turned east towards the military road, leaving the estate smoke behind them and carrying home a report in which the most important discovery was that the missing had chosen not to be found. The military road appeared by late afternoon, firm beneath the soldiers' feet and pale beneath a lowering sky. After the hidden valley, its straightness felt almost severe. Ditches ran on either side. Milestones rose at intervals, their inscriptions weathered but still legible. Cartwheels had worn 2 shallow grooves into the surface, and along the verges lay the traces of many travelers. Mule droppings, broken straw, a lost sandal strap, and the ash of old cooking fires. Sabinus turned the patrol west. They would not reach the fort before dark, but a small watch station stood several miles ahead. It consisted of a stone tower, a walled yard, a stable, and 2 low buildings where messengers and patrols could rest. Such places gave the frontier its true strength. A wall alone could mark a boundary, but roads and stations allowed orders to travel, supplies to move, and soldiers to appear where they were needed. Marcus walked beside Publius, who had grown unusually quiet. "What troubles you?" Marcus asked. "I thought the families had been taken." "So did I." And they had not. No. Publius looked down the long road. It would be easier if the signs meant only one thing. Marcus shifted the weight of his pack. Then they would not be signs. They would be orders. Near sunset, rain returned. It swept across the road in thin, slanting lines and turned the surrounding fields gray. When the watch station finally emerged, its tower stood dark against the western light, a small Roman island in the open country. The sentry challenged them from above. Passwords were exchanged, and the gate opened. Inside, the yard was crowded with pack animals and 2 covered carts traveling east. A military courier had arrived shortly before them, his horse steaming beneath a blanket. 3 merchants occupied one of the restrooms, guarding bundles of dyed cloth and complaining that the rain had entered through the roof. The station commander provided Sabinus with a corner of the yard for the patrol. Straw was brought from the stable, and a brazier was placed beneath an awning. There was not enough room inside for everyone, but after 2 days in the open, even a stone wall against the wind felt luxurious. The men cooked lentils with bacon and onions. Steam rose from the pot. Wet cloaks hung from pegs. Someone produced a small skin of wine, and it was passed carefully around the fire. Marcus drank only a mouthful. His body felt heavy with fatigue, yet his mind remained restless. He thought of the first farm, packed in silence, the second left in confusion, the comb beneath the fern, the cart hidden in the valley. He imagined how the story might have grown had the patrol not found the families. Perhaps people at the fort would have blamed the feud. Perhaps the red-cloaked leader would have been accused of taking them. Perhaps more soldiers would have crossed the wall because of 6 people who had chosen another road. History, Marcus thought, though he would not have used that word in such a way, could turn upon absences wrongly understood. The courier joined them beneath the awning. He was a young auxiliary rider with rain-darkened hair and a narrow scar beside one ear. His name was Cassianus, and he carried dispatches from a fort farther east. "Any news from the north?" Sabinus asked. Cassianus warmed his hands over the brazier. "Only the usual news. Stolen sheep, a quarrel over a bride, a watchtower roof blown away." Publius smiled. "The empire survives." "For another night." The courier told them that the road west remained clear, though a stream had flooded near a bridge. Engineers were repairing the bank. Another patrol had reported gatherings north of the wall, but none large enough to threaten the forts. This was how the frontier breathed. Rumor arriving, being measured, then either fading or becoming an order. Marcus lay down after supper with his cloak rolled beneath his head. Rain tapped upon the awning. Horses moved in the stable. Somewhere in the station, one of the merchants snored with astonishing force. The sound passed through the wall and seemed to vibrate in the stones. Titus listened for a while. "If northern raiders hear that," he murmured, "they will believe we keep bears." Marcus fell asleep smiling. At dawn, the rain had stopped. Mist filled the fields, leaving the road suspended between white emptiness on either side. The patrol departed after bread and watered wine. The courier rode east. The merchants remained behind, still arguing over their damp cloth. As the soldiers continued west, signs of the military world grew more frequent. They passed a wagon carrying roof tiles stamped with a legionary mark. An auxiliary patrol rode by in the opposite direction, cloaks drawn tight around their shoulders. Near a roadside shrine, a veteran offered oil at a small stone altar before continuing towards a nearby farm. By noon, the mist lifted. The wall appeared across the northern heights. From here, Marcus could see how it followed the ridges, rising and falling with the land. Towers punctuated its line. Beyond it lay the hills he had crossed twice in a few days, no longer mysterious, though never fully known. They stopped near a mile castle for the midday meal. The gate passage smelled of damp stone and old smoke. 4 soldiers stationed there shared news with Sabinus while Marcus sat upon the southern bank eating bread and cheese. One of the Mile Castle men recognized Titus. "You are back again," he said, "against my better judgment." "Find a war?" "6 potters and a mule." The soldier nodded solemnly. "Dangerous people." The humor was quiet and familiar. Men on the frontier learned to distrust grand stories, for most duties ended not in battles, but in lost animals, disputed goods, broken carts, weather, sickness, and misunderstandings. The patrol resumed its march. Late in the afternoon, the fort roofs came into view. Smoke rose from the workshops. The bathhouse chimney sent a darker column into the clear air. Marcus felt the same easing in his chest as before, though this time the return seemed less triumphant, and more inevitable, as if the road had simply completed a circle. At the gate, Sabinus gave the password. The soldiers entered. A clerk was waiting in the headquarters courtyard before they had even removed their packs. Sabinus handed over the wax tablet containing the names of the missing families and Aelia Cata's account. The report passed from one pair of hands to another, already becoming part of the fort's records. Marcus was dismissed. He cleaned only the worst mud from his sandals before leaving through the eastern gate. Evening had begun to soften the settlement streets. Lamps glowed in workshops. The baker's shutters stood open, and the smell of warm bread drifted across the road. Flavia sat outside the house with the gray feather in her lap. She saw Marcus, sprang to her feet, and ran towards him. "You did not take it," she said. "I found the north without it." She accepted this answer and held out the feather. "You can borrow it next time." Marcus knelt and gathered her into his arms. Over her shoulder he saw Livia in the doorway. She did not ask whether there would be a next time. They both knew the answer. Behind the settlement, the fort trumpet sounded the evening change of watch. Along the distant wall, sentries moved into place. Gates were checked. Lamps were lit. Beyond the hills, families tended fires in farmhouses, estates, and old enclosures. Some under Roman protection, some beyond it, all beneath the same darkening sky. Marcus carried Flavia home while the feather trembled lightly between her fingers. The feather soon found a place above the hearth, tucked into a crack between two stones where the rising warmth made its soft edges stir. For several days, Marcus remained within the fort. The patrols continued without him. Men came and went through the gates carrying reports of flooded tracks, disputed cattle, and smoke seen far to the north. None of the messages became an alarm. The feud beyond the wall quieted into wary separation, as such quarrels often did when winter approached, and households had more urgent concerns than pride. Marcus returned to the ordinary shape of service. He drilled in the rain. He stood watch beneath clear stars. He helped unload sacks of grain from a wagon whose axle complained at every turn. He carried roofing tiles to a barrack where water had begun to drip through the ceiling. He spent half a morning clearing mud from a drain, and another copying equipment marks for a clerk whose writing hand had swollen with cold. Nothing in these duties would ever be carved upon a monument. Yet each task held the fort together. Autumn deepened over the frontier. The green hills turned brown and copper. Birch leaves gathered in wet corners of the streets. The daylight shortened, and frost remained in shaded places long after sunrise. Inside the granaries, the raised floors kept stores above damp ground and allowed air to pass beneath them. Men inspected the sacks for rot and mice. Barrels of salted meat stood in orderly rows. Dried beans, lentils, grain, oil, and wine were counted again and again, because winter could make a small error dangerous. Marcus often thought of Rome as a place of marble, temples, and crowds, though he had never seen the city. The Rome he knew was different. It lived in lists, ration measures, stamped tiles, repair schedules, and the steady arrival of wagons before the roads became impassable. One evening, Crispus called the sentry together. The men assembled in the barrack yard beneath a sky streaked with red cloud. Their breath showed faintly in the cooling air. "A detachment is being sent west," the centurion said. "Repairs are needed at a signal tower. 6 days, perhaps 7. A quiet discomfort moved through the ranks. Everyone had learned to distrust the word perhaps. Crispus read the names. Marcus was not among them. For a moment, relief came so strongly that he felt ashamed of it. Then he looked at Publius, whose name had been called. The young recruit stood very still, trying to appear unaffected. After dismissal, Marcus found him in the barracks packing a cloak. "You have enough dry cloth?" Marcus asked. Publius nodded. "Spare laces?" Another nod. "Oil for the sandals?" Publius looked at him. "Are you becoming Titus?" "Someone must." Marcus gave him a small packet of mint from Livia's stores. "For the water," he said. Publius accepted it carefully. The detachment departed before dawn the following morning. Marcus watched from the wall as the line of men passed westward beneath the mist, their shields dark against the pale road. Within minutes they were gone. The fort seemed quieter without them. That afternoon Marcus was assigned to the hospital. The valetudinarium stood near the central buildings, arranged around an open courtyard where light entered the wards. It was cleaner than the barracks and smelled of vinegar, herbs, linen, smoke, and the faint metallic scent of blood. Most of the patients were not wounded in battle. One soldier had broken 2 fingers beneath a wagon wheel. Another suffered from fever. A cavalryman lay with a swollen knee after being thrown from his horse. Iogen, the trader, occupied a bed near the inner wall, his ribs tightly wrapped but healing well. He greeted Marcus with a dry smile. "They have given me broth for 4 days. You are alive. That does not make it good broth?" Marcus helped carry fresh water, scrub bowls, shake out blankets, and hold a lamp while an orderly examined the wagon driver's hand. The work required gentleness of a kind rarely praised in military life. Men accustomed to lifting stones and shields learned to raise an injured comrade without causing pain, to turn a fevered body, or to wash someone too weak to wash himself. Near sunset, Iogen asked Marcus to sit. From beneath his blanket, the trader produced a small wooden token carved with the shape of a bird. "My daughter sent it," he said. "She says I owe the soldiers who found me. You owe the pony. The pony ran away. It brought us to you." Iogen considered this. "Then the pony owes you." Marcus laughed softly. He refused the token, but Iogen insisted until he accepted it. Gifts traveled through the frontier like words. To reject one too firmly could close a door that kindness had opened. When Marcus left the hospital, the first snow had begun. It came lightly, almost too fine to see, settling upon roof tiles and the shoulders of sentries. Soldiers paused in the streets and looked upward. Snow was not rare in Britain, but the first fall always changed the fort. Familiar edges softened. Mud vanished beneath white. The wall beyond the gate became pale against the dark land. Marcus went to the settlement. Flavia was already outside, trying to catch flakes upon her tongue. Livia stood in the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders, smiling at the child's seriousness. Marcus lifted Flavia and carried her beneath the open sky. "Is this northern snow?" she asked. "All snow is northern when it falls here." She thought about this, then held out her hand until a flake landed upon her palm and vanished. Inside, the hearth burned brightly. Livia had prepared a stew of barley, cabbage, and pork. Marcus placed Iogen's wooden bird beside the gray feather. Flavia immediately claimed it as the feather's companion. Beyond the walls, winter settled over roads, farms, rivers, and abandoned tracks. Travel would slow. Patrols would become shorter and colder. Watchmen would stand beneath heavier cloaks while ice gathered in the ditches. The empire did not sleep for winter. Its lamps still burned in headquarters rooms. Couriers still rode between forts. Granaries were opened and sealed. Gates turned upon iron hinges at dawn and dusk. But that evening, as snow covered the settlement and softened every distant sound, Marcus sat close to the hearth with Livia and Flavia, listening to the quiet. For a few hours, the frontier seemed not like the edge of an empire, but the center of a small, warm world. The snow remained for 3 days. By the 4th morning, rain had begun to loosen it from the roofs. Water ran from the eaves in steady threads. White fields became brown again, and the fort streets returned to mud beneath the feet of men carrying baskets, tools, firewood, and orders. Marcus stood second watch at the eastern gate. The hour before dawn was the coldest. Lamps burned low in the guard chamber, and the stone beneath his sandals seemed to draw warmth through leather and wool. Beyond the gate, the settlement lay dark except for the baker's oven and one light in the hospital. The wall was invisible from there, hidden by rain and night. Marcus leaned upon his spear and listened to the water falling into the roadside ditch. Many years earlier, during his first months in Britain, such a watch had seemed endless. He had counted breaths, steps, stones, and imagined dangers. Now he understood that the frontier was made largely from waiting. Waiting for dawn. Waiting for a cart delayed by weather. Waiting for a messenger from the next fort. Waiting for a rumor to become truth, or dissolve into nothing. Waiting for years of service to gather one ordinary day at a time. At last, the darkness thinned. The eastern clouds became gray, and shapes returned to the road. A dog emerged from beneath a wagon. Smoke began rising from the settlement. The gate commander arrived, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and ordered the doors opened. Wood groaned upon iron pivots. Morning entered the fort. Marcus was leaving the gate when a courier rode in from the west. Mud covered the horse to its chest. The rider dismounted stiffly and handed a sealed tablet to the duty clerk. Marcus recognized the cloak before he recognized the man. It was Publius. The detachment from the signal tower had returned during the night to a smaller fort farther west. Publius had been sent ahead with the report. He looked older than he had 6 days before, though perhaps it was only the mud and the dark hollows beneath his eyes. Marcus crossed the yard. "Did the tower defeat you?" Publius gave him a tired smile. The roof tried. The repairs had taken longer than expected. Wind had stripped tiles from the upper platform, and frost had cracked part of the parapet. The men had hauled timber uphill, reset stones, cleared a blocked drain, and slept in a storeroom whose door would not close. "No northern warriors?" Marcus asked. "One shepherd, 3 goats. The goats were hostile." Marcus nodded. "You are fortunate to return." Publius reached into his pack and produced the packet of mint, now empty. "The water was bad," he said. "This helped." He handed Marcus the folded cloth as though returning something valuable. There was no ceremony for the detachment. By midday, the rest of the men arrived, wet, exhausted, and carrying tools in orderly bundles. Their report entered the headquarters. The repaired tower resumed its place within the chain of signals. Lamps could be seen from it again, and messages might pass along the hills. The work had been completed. That was enough. Winter moved slowly after that. The days narrowed. Frost silvered the ramparts. Rain struck the roofs for hours, then stopped so suddenly that the fort seemed to hold its breath. Men trained beneath covered spaces when the yard became too soft. Armor was inspected. Cloaks were mended. grain was issued and ground. Marcus stood many watches. He marched patrols south of the wall and once traveled east with a wagon convoy carrying salt, oil, and new spear shafts. He helped repair the bathhouse furnace when smoke began filling the warm room. He spent 2 days in the granary, counting sacks for a clerk who distrusted every number, including his own. No great invasion came. No emperor visited. No victory was proclaimed. Yet the frontier endured. Iogan recovered and left the hospital before midwinter. He departed through the eastern gate with a slower step and a new respect for his pony, which had been returned to him after several arguments over stable fees. Before leaving, he stopped at Livia's father's workshop. Marcus found him there buying a new cloak pin. "This one is plain," Iogan said, holding up a bronze circle. "Your daughter will object. She can buy the next one." He fastened it at his shoulder and looked towards the wall. "I will travel south until spring. A wise choice. I have never made those consistently." Then he was gone, leading the pony along the road while light snow drifted over the fields. Kalidas did not return that winter. News of him arrived through traders. The feud north of the wall had ended without a final settlement. One household paid cattle to another. Oaths were spoken. Several families remained west. Others returned to their farms when the first hard frost made travel difficult. The young man in the red cloak still held influence, though less than before. Brennus had gone home. Aliacata's estate continued producing pottery for settlements near the frontier. The 6 missing people remained there. Their names stayed upon a wax tablet in the fort until the writing was smoothed away and the surface used for something else. Marcus sometimes thought of them when carts arrived from the east. He wondered whether the child had received a second shoe, whether the woman still wore her bone comb, whether the old man had repaired every basket in the valley. He would probably never know. A soldier's knowledge was often brief. He entered places, observed fragments, and moved on. Years passed in this manner. Marcus grew broader through the shoulders and grayer near the temples. Publius stopped being the youngest man in the barracks. Titus completed his service and settled near Eboracum, where he married a widow who owned a bakery. Lucius remained with the legion and continued defending fish sauce against all criticism. Flavia grew tall enough to reach the shelf above the hearth. The gray feather there gradually lost its shape. The wooden bird darkened from smoke. The antler bead became smooth from years of handling. Livia's father gave Marcus more work whenever military duties allowed, teaching him how to judge leather by touch, how to cut around a weak place in a hide, and how to stitch a sole so water found fewer ways through it. Marcus began to imagine the life after service not as a distant reward, but as a place with rooms, tools, customers, and morning light. When his 25 years were complete, the discharge came without grandeur. His name was read. His accounts were settled. He received the documents that marked his honorable release and the benefits owed to him. The sword he had carried for years was no longer required at his side. His shield remained in the armory for another soldier. His place in the barracks was given to a recruit who arrived from a province Marcus had never visited. On his final morning, he woke before the trumpet. The contubernium room was dark. Men slept around him beneath rough blankets. Equipment hung where it always had. The brazier held a faint red glow. Marcus dressed quietly. He touched the wall beside his bed, not from superstition, but because his hand had rested there on thousands of mornings. Then he lifted his small bundle and stepped outside. Mist lay over the fort. The streets were empty except for a sentry crossing the headquarters courtyard. Granaries, workshops, barracks, and tiled roofs rose in familiar silence. Every corner held some memory. Laughter after a wet march, an inspection, a punishment, the smell of bread, a friend leaving, a messenger arriving before dawn. Marcus walked to the north gate. The wall stretched away into the mist. He climbed the steps and stood upon the rampart one last time as a soldier. The hills beyond were quiet. Heather bent beneath the wind. A raven crossed the pale sky, flying north without road, order, or boundary. Marcus watched until it disappeared. He had once imagined the empire ended at the wall. Now he knew that no empire ended so neatly. Rome continued beyond it in traded buckles, borrowed words, old sandals, agreements, marriages, pottery, and memories. The northern world entered the forts in wool, cattle, rumors, names, and people seeking shelter. The frontier was not a line. It was a wide, living country where countless lives met. Behind Marcus, the trumpet sounded. Men began waking. Doors opened. Smoke rose. Another day of service commenced without him. He descended from the rampart and left through the eastern gate. Livia and Flavia were waiting beside the road. Flavia was nearly grown, though she still wore the antler bead upon a cord around her neck. Livia held a folded cloak over one arm. Her hair had begun to silver, and her expression carried the same calm patience with which she had watched him depart so many times. Marcus stopped before them. "No pack?" Flavia asked. "Only this." "No shield?" "No shield." "No orders?" Marcus looked back towards the fort. The gate stood open. Soldiers crossed beneath it. A cart waited to enter, its driver arguing with the clerk over the count of grain sacks. Above, a sentry paced the wall. "No orders," Marcus said. They walked together towards the settlement. Rain had begun to fall, soft enough that no one raised a hood. The road shone beneath the morning light. Beyond the roofs, smoke drifted from workshops and ovens. Somewhere a hammer struck leather upon a wooden last. Marcus entered the house beside Livia. The hearth was warm. On the shelf above it rested a bent gray feather, a wooden bird, and a small row of colored stones gathered by a child many winters before. Outside, the empire continued in all its noise and weight, its roads stretching across mountains, deserts, forests, and seas. Emperors would rise and vanish. Forts would be repaired, abandoned, rebuilt, and remembered. Names carved upon stone would survive while thousands of others faded. But for Marcus, the long frontier had narrowed at last to a familiar room. Rain upon the roof, Livia beside the fire, and Flavia laughing as she tried to hang his old cloak where there was no military rule to say it must go. The trumpet sounded faintly beyond the settlement. Marcus heard it. Then he sat down at his own hearth and did not rise.